Good day. Today is Friday, 4th April 2025, and we are in the second day of New World, inaugurated by Donald Trump with his massive announcements of tariffs that he's basically imposed right across the world. Now, some people have made calculations about the tariffs. Of course, tariffs country by country are one thing, but Trump has also imposed tariffs on specific imports, for example, of motor vehicles into the United States, which means that, say, a country like Britain, which in theory is only subject to 10% tariffs on goods that it exports to the United States, will quickly find that some goods that it exports to the United States are charged at a higher rate. Motor vehicles, well, Britain perhaps doesn't make huge numbers of them, but it does make 3 motor cars that I know do find American buyers. These are Land Rovers and, of course, Bentleys and Rolls Royces. Now, these are pretty expensive cars already. They're going to become still more expensive, and I wonder how attractive that will make them for the very rich people who can still afford them. But anyway, that's another question. I'm not going to get sidetracked by all that now. Anyway, coming back, there's been some people who've made calculations about the overall weight of the tariffs, and I've seen that the consensus view is that they stand at somewhere between, that their weighted level is somewhere between 22% and 29% in terms of the total value of goods imported into the United States. Now, that, if true, would mean that they are actually higher than the Smoot-Hartley tariffs imposed by the United States in the 1920s, which many believe, rightly or wrongly, were a contributory factor to the Great Depression of the 1930s. So the United States has gone all the way back to the kind of protection policies that it followed all those years ago. It's as if the entire system of gradually liberalizing and freeing up world trade that began after the Second World War has now been put into reverse. Now, I would like to just make one further point. I'm not going to spend most of this program discussing tariffs, important though that topic is, but there's a particular point I do want to make again, which is, once more, that this is a retreat by the United States, a withdrawal by the United States from the world which it has largely created and shaped itself. What basically happened after the Second World War is that the United States, at that time, indisputably the preeminent economic, political and military power in the world, but absolutely the preeminent economic power. It's easy to forget, but in the mid-1940s, directly after the Second World War, the United States accounted for something like over 50% of world manufacturing, world industrial output and manufacturing. Its economic dominance was such as no other country in history has ever achieved before or since. Anyway, what the United States essentially sought to do was to dominate economically and politically the world by, in effect, incorporating the world in one form or other into the American economy. Now, that may sound a little bit bizarre, but of course, if your economy is bigger than that of everyone else combined, which is how it appeared in the 1940s to policymakers in the United States, that might not have seemed as fantastical and as unrealistic and indeed utopian as it does today. So the idea was integrate the entire global economy, or at least the non-communist parts of the economy, into the United States. That will, of course, mean that the likelihood of them falling under the control of the communists in the Soviet Union was reduced. This was, after all, the time of the Cold War. But it was also a mechanism to establish American geostrategic and political dominance. And of course, this is the time period when you had articles and books talking about the American century and all that sort of thing. And ultimately, this is what the Bretton Woods system that was created in 1944 was mostly about. Not entirely about. There were many intelligent and well-intentioned people who participated in the Bretton Woods Conference. There was a general desire to avoid a fallback into the system that had led to the Great Depression, which correctly was seen as the precursor of the Second World War. But beneath it all, there was also undoubtedly an agenda abroad at that time to subordinate the world, or at least the non-communist part of the world, to the United States, and to do so in a way that ultimately benefited the United States itself. It was expected and presumed that this would be a hierarchical reorganization of the world. It would be the world integrated into the US economy and ultimately subordinated to the US economy, which was assumed would indefinitely maintain its preeminence. And, well, it was also presumed that the United States, politically and geostrategically, would retain its preeminence as well. Well, that was the thinking in the 1940s and 1950s. It didn't actually survive in quite that way for very long. In the mid to late 1960s, mostly as a result of the war in Vietnam, the United States began to realize that, powerful as it wasn't all powerful, and that there were limits to US power. In particular, the US found that it was obliged to run deficits, budget deficits, and trade deficits in order to maintain the system. And these ultimately undermined certain aspects of the system as it had been developed in the 1940s. And then, as a result, in the 1970s, there was a major shock and readjustment to the system, which was, of course, the decision taken in 1971 to allow the dollar to float and to break, finally and conclusively, the connection to gold. Now, there's been a good article which you can find in the British magazine Unheard, UNHERD, by the Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis, which describes the Nixon shock fairly well. It shows how the United States, or at least some people in the United States at that time, made a conscious decision to break up the kind of system that had been created in the 1940s, basically in order to reconstitute it around the United States in a somewhat different form. The dollar maintained its reserve currency status. The United States continued to run budget and trade deficits. But the arrangements that were made at that time were such as to ensure that international capital from that point onward flowed into the United States, enabling the United States to fund these deficits without significant stress to itself and to maintain its geostrategic dominance. Now, I fully agree with this part of Varoufakis' analysis. Where I think he's going, where I have some issues with him, is that he assumes that what the current administration has done, what Donald Trump is doing, is a kind of reverse Nixon shock, in the sense that it is seeking to recalibrate the system again around the United States, accumulate capital in the United States, but using tariff mechanisms in a similar way to the way in which Nixon and his team used the decoupling of the dollar from gold. I think that is probably wrong. I think this is better understood as a grudging realization in the United States that the whole system that was created in the 1940s has now exhausted itself, or at least it has exhausted the United States. The titan that the United States once was has now become weary and cannot any longer shoulder the burden which it assumed for itself of global leadership and global dominance. And for that reason, it is reverting back to the system which existed before this big attempt to achieve global dominance by integrating the global economy into the United States in the 1940s was made. So I would say that it is definitely the end of globalization. I think in time, inevitably, it is going to be the end of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. The United States, the Trump administration, seems to be very keen at the moment to try to preserve the preeminence of the dollar in some form over the next couple of years, even though, even before these latest steps, that was looking increasingly unlikely. But anyway, that was their plan. I don't myself see how, in a situation where trade is increasingly chaotic, where the United States is pitted against powerful or even coeval economic rivals such as China, it's any longer possible. It will be possible for any length of time to go on insisting that the dollar be used as the reserve currency, as was agreed at Bretton Woods way back in the 1940s. So I think the reserve currency existence of the dollar, if this policy of tariffs is maintained, is now in its final days. There will be some effort to sustain it for a while, and of course the dollar still has advantages. It's the only fully liquid currency that there is that can fulfill this kind of role. There's no obvious replacement to the dollar as a single reverse currency. But I am coming to the view that the world of reserve currencies as we have known them, with first sterling and then the dollar, is anyway coming to an end. I think that things are going to be traded in different ways from now on, through digital currencies, through other kinds of platforms, through highly sophisticated bartering arrangements, through whatever, but that it will no longer be possible to use the dollar in the way that it used to be, because this new turn of the United States back on itself is ultimately incompatible with the dollar functioning as a reserve currency, just as the protectionism that the United States practiced before the Second World War also worked against the dollar becoming a reserve currency during that period. So there we are. That's what I think is likely to happen in the medium to long term. And I say the medium term, probably not the very long medium term. In 5-10 years' time, we will be clearly in a post-dollar world. That, of course, always assumes that these tariffs will continue, that they will survive Donald Trump. My own guess is that they will. Certainly there will be tremendous turbulence right across the global economy. Some of that will undoubtedly affect the United States itself. Almost certainly there will be higher inflation in the United States and in many other countries, in fact, in most of the world. But in spite of that, I don't get the sense that there is a huge pushback against this idea of tariffs in the United States, not from the political class, not from the wider population. And I suspect that it's going to be very difficult indeed once Trump is off the scene to unwind them. And besides, even if they are unwound in some form, everybody knows around the world that they were imposed in the first place. So governments around the world are going to say to themselves, economic players around the world are going to say to themselves, well, you cannot absolutely assume that the United States will continue to follow basically open trade, because they've shown that they have the ability to reverse it, and there's every possibility that they will reverse it again. Now, I said in my long program yesterday that various institutions which have emerged as a result of the globalized world that the Americans created, that those will start to wither and eventually die. I saw that the chair of the World Trade Organization suddenly cropped up yesterday and made certain comments saying that it was all very unfortunate that all of this was happening, and that the World Trade Organization was as important as ever because it was the place where all of these things could be discussed. I haven't got the impression that Donald Trump is interested in discussing what he's doing with anybody, quite honestly. And I can't imagine that the World Trade Organization really has much future, given the way in which the United States has just acted, just to say. And, well, this brings me back to the European Union, because, of course, it was itself a product of the globalized system, of the gradual lifting of trade barriers, initially within Europe, but subsequently around the world. Some people undoubtedly did see the European Union as a kind of prototype of what a fully globalized world might be like, the way in which a fully globalized world economy might function, with a regulatory center and free movement of goods and labor around the world and all that sort of thing. I have to say that with restrictions, with tariffs being imposed and countries around the world starting to create their own tariff walls in response to the tariff walls that the Americans are creating, I have to say I think this experiment that's happened in Europe sooner or later is going to unwind and will be over. Countries in Europe are going to want to protect their own industries and their own economies. At some point, European publics will insist on it. Political forces will develop within the Union that insist on it as well. Without the support and protection of the United States, without the belief that globalization is the wave of the future, I cannot see how this thing can hold. By the way, that is clearly the view of some people in Russia as well. Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chair of the Security Council in Russia, chairman of the Russian Military Industrial Commission, arguably Putin's real number two, former president of Russia, and for many years Prime Minister of Russia, and now unabashed and forceful hardliner, has also said that he believes that the European Union is now in severe trouble. And Russia's redoubtable foreign ministry spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, has made comments to the same effect. And, well, they appear, shall I say, entirely unconcerned about the fact that the European Union, as we have known it, may be in serious trouble, and in Medvedev's case, perhaps terminal trouble. But for us in Europe who live here, it could very well be a very chaotic and unhappy end, just saying. Anyway, there we are. Now, China has responded to the tariffs, and here I want to correct an error that I made in yesterday's program. I said that the tariffs that had been imposed on China were 34%, which appeared to me less than certainly I had expected. What I did not appreciate is that these 34% tariffs have been stuck on top of the 20% tariffs that Trump had already slapped on Chinese goods just, I think, 2 weeks ago. So the actual tariffs that will be levied on Chinese goods imported into the United States over, as compared with, say, the 1st of March, the increase will be 54%. This is a huge increase. I don't know that it will choke off imports into the United States from China entirely. The Chinese have shown an astonishing ability to absorb tariff blows, and it's not impossible that they will respond to some of these moves by taking action to maintain their competitiveness in the American market. For example, by allowing the RMB, the Chinese currency, to depreciate against the dollar. The dollar currently is rapidly depreciating against all major currencies. But anyway, it could be that the Chinese will try and do something like that, or they will try to increase the efficiency of their production, something which they seem fully able, almost continuously to do. But my own sense is that what Alex Christoforou and I used to speak of as a long-term negotiated divorce between the United States and China, which was initiated during Donald Trump's first term, has now rapidly evolved into a complete marriage breakdown, an angry marriage breakdown. China today has retaliated. It has slapped on 34% tariffs on all US imports into China, starting from 10th April. The China's General Administration of Customs has suspended import qualifications of 6 US enterprises. China is now launching anti-dumping probes into imported medical CT tubes from the US. China has announced export controls on items related to tungsten, tellurium, bismuth, molybdenum, indium. There are other measures that the Chinese also seem to be intending to make as well. These are just some of them. One way or the other, it seems to me that the Chinese are hitting back hard against the United States. And given that what has driven the United States to this decision to start embarking on tariff wars, because we are talking about tariff wars, to reverse the entire policy of an open, globalized economy as a mechanism of achieving geostrategic dominance, which the United States started out on in the 1940s, has been the challenge from China. I think it's highly likely that the United States is going to respond aggressively to these Chinese moves. So we quite plausibly, over the next few weeks and months, could be seeing a tariff spiral between the Chinese and the Americans. And I, for one, in this atmosphere, would not be that surprised if eventually we got to a point where trading levels between the United States and China were sharply reduced or even almost entirely brought to a stop. I know that this is almost inconceivable to many people. But then the events of the last 10 weeks, since Donald Trump was elected president of the United States, would also have seemed inconceivable not so long ago. And to repeat again, he doesn't seem to be under any significant political or popular pressure so far in the United States to change course. On the contrary, my own sense is that there is still a critical mass of support within the United States. I'm not saying majority support in the United States, merely a critical mass of support in the United States, basically backing him and, if anything, wanting him to go further still. And, well, that's China, the other major economic trading power that is now facing these moves by the United States is, of course, the European Union. It's not clear what they intend to do. They appear to be sharply divided with each other, as always. But already Emmanuel Macron is talking about taking action to stop European investment in the United States. In other words, to prevent European companies from relocating to the United States. And I personally would not be surprised if over time, in this new landscape that we are seeing, calls like that start to grow. In Germany, in other places as well, people will start to say, as they watch their local companies relocate to the United States, that this cannot be allowed, that American bullying and coercion, economic coercion in this fashion, cannot be tolerated, and steps could be taken to ensure that European companies remain in Europe. And inevitably that will mean growing intervention in the European economy by governments, and perhaps initially by the European Centre, in order to protect European industry from this kind of pressure by the United States, and quite plausibly a further tariff spiral starting to evolve as well. So there we are, the end of globalization, the breakdown of the existing system. One point where I do agree with Yanis Varoufakis about what is coming is that out of the ruins of this system, the old system, which was a system which, to repeat again, the Americans created. They are deeply critical. They're very, very angry about the way they feel they were taken advantage of by foreigners. But the reality is that the foreigners always acted within the rules that the Americans themselves had set. If we talk about China, I can remember for decades, right through the 1990s, well into the early 2000s or mid-2000s, everything, the entire relationship between the United States and China appeared to be an entirely amicable one. There was comments, I remember reading articles and commentaries about how the relocation of American factories into China really didn't mean anything. It just meant that China was taking over that part of the production process, which the United States itself was no longer interested in, because supposedly the Americans were moving into a higher technological universe, one which the Chinese could never aspire to. Just saying. There was talk at that time of Chimerica, China, America, as basically a kind of single economic unit. As many people in the United States are now very critical of China, they talk about Chinese predatory economic practices. And no doubt, even 20 years ago, there was a lot of disaffection in American industrial cities amongst blue-collar workers who were being pushed out of their jobs as their companies relocated production to China and Mexico and such other places. That was far from being the general mood at the time. People simply did what the Americans wanted them to do, because the Americans saw globalization as a mechanism to integrate the world under American leadership. Just so. So anyway, what I think will start to happen, and I think Varoufakis here is absolutely right, is that we will see other countries move forward with their alternative trading systems. This ultimately is what BRICS is all about, trying to create mechanisms to try to protect the Chinese economy and other economies from the kind of steps that the United States has taken, which we have just seen. It's now clear that many governments, the Chinese government in particular, saw the increased use by the United States of sanctions as essentially a precursor to the tariff policies that we are now seeing. And there's been a very interesting article in, of all places, The Economist, the one magazine which has been consistently neocon, pro-American, defender of the neoliberal status quo, ardently supportive of American foreign policy, increasingly critical of China itself. There's a long article in The Economist saying that actually they've just been to China, they find people in China confident that they can weather this storm because of all the mechanisms and restructuring within the Chinese economy that has taken place, how Xi Jinping saw this all coming, and all of the various steps he took were intended to prepare China for precisely this shock. It's an extraordinary comment, by the way, if you've been reading The Economist and have become accustomed to the relentless abuse and criticism of Xi Jinping that they have been engaging in over the last 15 years. But anyway, that's another story. That China is prepared for this, that it's working with its BRICS partners, and that it's confident that it will weather the storm, and that far from people in China being alarmed or shocked or demoralized or frightened, they are girding themselves to confront these challenges and to prepare confidently for the future. Well, we shall see. So this is the world we are in. The United States retreating. These actions it has taken over the last couple of days, last couple of weeks in fact, are, if you like, an admission of American decline. Certainly a decline from the preeminent position the United States held in the 1940s, and a decline even from the position the United States held in the 1970s. An admission of American decline, with China now a economy which in real terms is actually bigger than the US economy, ready for this and having prepared its plans to adjust to this challenge as it comes, and with plenty of partners. I spoke about Wang Yi's visit to Moscow over the last couple of days. There's been a long article in Global Times about the recent trilateral meeting between China, Japan, and South Korea. The article is entitled "Why the China-Japan-South Korea Dialogue Matters to the World." In a world increasingly shaped by fractured alliances, three Asian neighbors, China, Japan, and South Korea, have quietly revived a long dormant trilateral dialogue. The 13th Japan-China South Korea trilateral economic and trade ministers meeting was held in Seoul recently. Their foreign ministers also met in Tokyo on March 22nd for the first time in 4 years. While no sweeping agreements emerged, this revival is profound and has significant regional and global stability implications. Now, at this point, it's perhaps worth adding one further point. The United States today, by some estimates which perhaps overstate things, accounts for around 13% of global demand. 13%, obviously, is a very significant proportion of global demand, but it means that 87% of global demand is outside the United States. And as I said, probably those figures overstate anyway the American proportion. The rest of the world, if it gets its act together, is able to surmount this. They will be able to trade with each other. They will be able to bypass the United States. The United States may be retreating into tariff wars. Some of the other economies are likely to follow. But one way or another, it is likely that there will be enough left, more than enough left, to create a fully functional and successful trading system without the United States and whatever other countries choose to follow it on this particular course. Now, amongst the countries, by the way, which are likely to move towards supporting any future trading system, one which inevitably is going to have China at its core, amongst those countries, I think inevitably is going to be India, but also the African countries. The United States has extended a certain leniency towards the Latin American states. They have generally been hit with only 10% sanctions, which, given all that's happened, looks relatively generous. For reasons that are completely unclear, African countries, small and poor places like Lesotho, but even other much bigger ones, have been hit much worse. I don't know why this was so, but I can't help but think, going back to earlier discussions that Alex Christoforou and I have had, that this has something of the quality, again, of spheres of influence about it. The United States is looking to integrate Latin America into its sphere of influence, and for that reason, it is treating Latin American economies more favorably, whereas it has already decided maybe that Africa is beyond its reach and is going to have to be abandoned. I can't really see any other possible justification for this, given that the size of exports by African economies to the United States is relatively low. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say today about tariffs and trade. I don't expect to return to this topic anytime immediately in the next couple of programs. I do, but I will presumably have to return to it eventually, because this is such a big event that it's going to be impossible to ignore and disregard. Anyway, what is going on elsewhere in the world? Well, the major conflict continues to be the one in Ukraine, and I have been, over the last 24 hours, been looking more closely at the military situation in Ukraine than I have done for some time. And I now realize that I have actually, if anything, underestimated the extent of Ukraine's military crisis over the last few weeks, without ever accepting the stalemate narrative that some people have been promoting. General Cavalli, by the way, who is still NATO's military chief, one of the major players in the war, the undeclared war that the United States was waging against Russia in Ukraine. He is one of the commanders who played a key role in it. Anyway, he has actually said that, this is still a stalemated war. Ukraine will not be able, it's unlikely to be able to recover all of its territories. But there's no chance, no realistic possibility that Russia can ever defeat or conquer the whole of Ukraine. Again, I sometimes wonder what information these people are getting. But anyway, comments like that made me think that, even though the situation was still obviously very clearly moving in Russia's favor, perhaps it wasn't moving quite as fast as it had been in the summer and autumn. I've now drastically revised that view. It's clear to me that things for the Ukrainians are going much more badly wrong than I had imagined. Firstly, and contrary to many of the stories and claims that have been made over the last couple of weeks about Ukrainian counterattacks in the area, it's now absolutely clear to me that the Ukrainians have suffered a major military defeat in the Toretsk, Chasiv Yar area. The Ukrainians did conduct a series of counterattacks in Toretsk. Every one of them was defeated. Ukrainian losses appear to have been horrendous. Significant groups of Ukrainian soldiers appear to have been cut off in Toretsk itself. They have now lost all of the ephemeral gains that they made as a result of those counterattacks that they did launch. But the net effect of that operation in Toretsk is that it weakened Ukrainian defenses elsewhere, closer to Konstantinovka, the major town in the area, which everybody assumes will be the next target of the Russian advance. And the Russians, as a result, have captured significant territory closer to Konstantinovka itself. Not only, in other words, have the Ukrainians been defeated, but the defeat has been a bad one which has incurred losses and which has left them in a weaker position, significantly weaker position than they had been in previously. Now, that's already pretty bad, but it looks as if the situation in Chasiv Yar was worse still. Now, there have been reports for some time that a significant force of Ukrainian troops has been encircled by the Russians in central Chasiv Yar. Now, about a week ago, 10 days ago, there were reports that the Ukrainians had launched a counterattack towards Chasiv Yar. Andrei Marochko, the Russian military commentator, just before these counterattacks, had said that around 85% of Chasiv Yar was under Russian control. He didn't mention the fact that there were Ukrainian troops encircled in the central area of Chasiv Yar. But it's now confirmed that this is essentially true. And it appears that this counterattack that the Ukrainians launched towards Chasiv Yar was basically an attempt to break that encirclement and either to reinforce the Ukrainian troops in the center of Chasiv Yar, or perhaps to organize their withdrawal, to facilitate their withdrawal. It is now clear that this counterattack has failed, that the Ukrainians have been thrown back, and that the Ukrainian grouping in central Chasiv Yar remains encircled. There's no word about how many troops there are there, Ukrainian troops there are there. Apparently there are other smaller groups of Ukrainian troops encircled in Toretsk itself. But anyway, there is no doubt that they are apparently encircled. I'm guessing that we're talking about hundreds of men rather than thousands. And given that this was a heavily fortified position, probably these troops are not without supplies. There's probably supplies of ammunition and equipment that they could still use. So this could be a battle that will take several weeks, possibly. But encircled is what they are. So, Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, the battles there are not only ending, but they have ended badly for the Ukrainians. They again lost the opportunity to conduct orderly retreats from these places, and they've suffered very heavy losses in doing so, and the situation for them has become much worse in consequence. The Russians are closer to Konstantinovka. They badly defeated the Ukrainians in Toretsk, and it looks like they're likely to do that in Chasiv Yar as well. Now, elsewhere, it looks equally bad in the sense that, again, I had to some extent lost track of what was going on in the Kupiansk area, north of Kupiansk, where the Russians have established a very large bridgehead west of the Oskol River. It looks like the Russians not only have established a bridgehead, and not only are they within 3 kilometers of Kupiansk itself, but they are gradually clearing the villages, moving south towards Kupiansk. Again, it looks as if the battle for Kupiansk itself is about to begin. And if you look at the maps, it looks almost as if Kupiansk itself is about to be surrounded on multiple sides. Now, again, rather like what happened in Chasiv Yar, instead of making the strategically logical choice of withdrawing from Kupiansk, which any rational commander would do, seeking to preserve his men, the Ukrainians have instead launched a counterattack, not towards these Russian forces that are closing on Kupiansk from the north, but on the Russian forces east of the Oskol River, in the area of the village of Sinkovka, which the Russians captured several months ago. And the idea seems to be to try to break through, reach a supply road which helps the Russians keep their troops in the Kupiansk area supplied, and to try to avert the operational crisis that the Ukrainians are experiencing there. It is most unlikely, and I'm being probably even optimistic on the Ukrainians' part, that this counteroffensive, which has the look of desperation about it, it seems that one of the units of the Azov Brigade, the 3rd Azov Brigade, has been committed to this counterattack. Anyway, it is most unlikely that this attack will be successful, this counterattack will be successful. I've seen drone footage which shows massive damage to Ukrainian forces, armored vehicles and that kind of thing, littering the landscape where this counterattack has been taking place. The Ukrainians, again, are throwing away lives of men and machines to try to break a siege which looks frankly unbreakable. Instead of, again, withdrawing, which what a weaker army in this kind of situation should logically seek to do, they are once again defending positions which they are unlikely to be able to keep. In fact, they're undoubtedly unable to keep, and are launching counterattacks which ultimately are going to leave them weaker. So it looks as if a major crisis is developing for the Ukrainians in the Kupiansk area, and I, for one, would not be surprised if, when the major Russian offensive begins in May, if Kupiansk is one of the first places to fall. Anyway, that's what's going on in that part of the battlefronts. Elsewhere, near Pokrovsk, there's again been many stories over the last few weeks, extending all the way back to February, in fact, about Ukrainian counterattacks south of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians have made multiple claims that they've recaptured Kotlino, southwest of Pokrovsk. There's never been proof that this is the case, and on many occasions when those claims have been made, they've been contradicted by photographic and film evidence that shows the Russians still in Kotlino. The Ukrainians have made attempts to recapture villages like Shevchenko and Pishanye. Again, there have been many claims that the Ukrainians have indeed captured these villages. Little evidence has ever been produced of this, and it seems that both villages are under Russian control. The Ukrainians have made more attempts to capture another village in this area called, I believe, Solino. Again, it doesn't look as if this village has fallen. But this morning, the Russian Defense Ministry claimed that the village of Uspenivka, which is precisely in this area and which has been bitterly fought over for some time, that village has now been captured by the Russians. It says the defense ministry has said that Uspenivka is indeed under Russian control. Now, that suggests to me that these counterattacks, these Ukrainian counterattacks, which have never looked particularly successful to me either, that they have been unsuccessful. And there's a lot of discussion and talk about logistic problems that the Russians have in maintaining their bridgehead in this area. But it seems that if the Russians do actually hold Uspenivka, which the Russian Defense Ministry says they now do, if they capture Uspenivka, then road and rail lines from the south open up for them, and many of these logistical problems will have been solved. So there we are. I mean, I don't know. I mean, as I said many times, I'm not there on the ground, but it looks as if these Ukrainian counterattacks in the Pokrovsk area might be about to fail as well. Likewise, with the Ukrainian offensive, if I can call it that, the Ukrainian incursion into Belgorod region, there are still claims that the Ukrainians have established some kind of presence in the village of Demidovo. I've no idea why anybody would think that that was any sort of achievement. But anyway, there are those claims. Group of Forces North is telling a different story about this. And they also claim that the Group of Forces North is in secure control of the village of Popovka, which adjoins Demidovo. They do admit that the Ukrainians hold some buildings in the outskirts of Demidovo. But the point is, putting all that to one side, again, multiple pictures have appeared of enormous armored vehicle losses by the Ukrainians in this area at a time when their armored vehicle stockpile, supplemented by the Biden administration in the autumn of 2024, and perhaps by Erdogan from Syrian army stocks, is again apparently rapidly depleting, with no certainty that come August, the United States and the European powers are going to be able to replace it. Anyway, there we are. So this counterattack, which has never made any sort of military sense, as far as I can see, is also serving to weaken the Ukrainians. Now, in Sumy region itself, which, by the way, Zelensky has just visited, always a bad sign for Ukrainian troops when Zelensky visits a particular theatre. It's usually a sign of oncoming failure and disaster. Anyway, in Sumy region, it now seems that the Russians have indeed captured the village of Basovka, which lies close to the main road, the road that used to lead from Sumy city in Sumy region in Ukraine to Suja, of course now, firmly under Russian control again. Anyway, the Russians, it seems, have captured Basovka. It's no longer being fought over. The entire village is under Russian control, though the Russian Defense Ministry has not yet confirmed this. And that, it seems to me, essentially severs the road between this road. It makes any further retreat by the remaining groups of Ukrainian troops still caught on the border, on the Russian side of the border in Kursk region, defending places like the village of Athleisure and Guyevo, all but impossible. and a group of forces north says that Guyevo has been mostly cleared. The other places are likely to be. But perhaps more important, it's now increasingly clear that the Russians have established a significant presence in Sumy region, and the possibility of some sort of offensive taking place there, again, is very real. And in the area which I said seemed to me to be the center of gravity of Russian military operations, which is Zaporozhye and southwest Donbass. Well, again, over the last 24 hours, there are more reports of further Russian advances. I'm beginning to lose count and lose ability to keep on track of the villages that the Russians are capturing. But anyway, this lava flow of Russian troops, as apparently the US military started to refer to it, back in the summer, continues moving and is moving quite fast. I would say at much the same rate that it moved during the summer. So, far from a stalemate, things are getting very bad. And there is an important difference between the situation now and the situation in the summer. Because last year, in 2024, the overriding focus of the Russian effort was on advances west of Avdiivka. After Avdiivka, this big fortified town, this fortress close to Donetsk, was captured in February. The Russians first captured Ocheretino, the village to the north of it. Then they advanced westwards. They took places like Ugledar, Kurakhovo, Selidovo, Novogrodivka, all of these places. They pushed to the outskirts of Pokrovsk. They started to move west of Pokrovsk. They took Velikaya Novosilka in January. Anyway, that was the main focus of Russian military operations. They did launch in May of last year an offensive towards Toretsk, which is successful and which has brought Toretsk and the entire Toretsk conurbation under Russian control. But this was the only sector of the front line where the Russians were particularly active over the course of 2024. This time, it is different. What we are seeing, and we've never seen this to this scale before, is of a Russian advance everywhere along the contact line. I haven't mentioned, for example, but the Russians are now also advancing north of Ozvizhenka. They've west of Ocheretino. They've managed to capture various villages like Alexandropil and others. They are gradually pushing Alexandrovka, Alexandropil, Pantelimonivka, Suchebalka, which is immediately to the north. These are villages that lie immediately to the west of Toretsk. They're now in a salient, and the Russians are rapidly clearing them. And they're also been advancing north of Vozvizhenka as well, cutting the main roads, acting in all of these places. Anyway, the point is that there is not a single sector of the entire 1,000-kilometer contact line which is not under pressure from the Russians. The Ukrainians may try other counterattacks in places like Belgorod, but everywhere else, the Russians are now advancing. They're advancing in Kharkiv region, in Kupiansk, In Volchansk itself, by the way, they're advancing, as we saw in the Toretsk, Chasov Yar area. They've assembled a sizable group of forces in the Liman area, encircling or threatening to encircle Siversk and recapturing Liman. They're advancing from Vozhizhenka. They've captured the village of Uspenivka near Pokrovsk. They're advancing in Zaporozhye, where they seem to be clearly now working towards encircling and eventually capturing the important town of Orekhov, which is the gateway to the city of Zaporozhye itself. There isn't a single part of the battlefront where the Russians are not advancing. And not only are the Russians now clearly advancing right across the battlefront, but they continue their missile and air attacks, drone attacks, right across Ukraine. Yesterday was another day of heavy Russian missile and drone attacks right across the entire territory of Ukraine. So, what General Cavalry was saying, that things are sort of stable, is simply not true. I said yesterday that the situation was far from being a stalemate. On the contrary, as I said, the lava flow, which is the Russian army, continues to move forward, and it is not moving forward by inches. It is moving forward, I would say, right across the battlefront, kilometers at a time. And I can remember earlier periods of the war, periods before especially the fall of Avdiivka, but also some weeks after the fall of Avdiivka, where weeks would pass and you would hear no reports of any village, for example, changing hands. Today, the Russian Defense Ministry routinely announces the capture of one, sometimes two, sometimes three villages every single day. Now, none of this, of course, tells us much about the wear and tear of the armies. And of course, there still remain all kinds of claims about casualties, which I am not going to discuss in this program. I will merely repeat my own belief that however high Russian casualties are, and I think they are wildly overstated, I've explained many times why I believe that. I also believe Ukrainian casualties are much heavier, and I've also explained in the past why I believe this to be the case. But anyway, we are getting reports today, mostly from Ukrainian sources, that the Russians have equipped the equivalent of 15 divisions. 15 divisions, perhaps 10,000 men per division, that these divisions have been trained up to the requisite levels and equipped with the requisite equipment. A force of perhaps 150,000 additional men who could be committed to the battle at some point by Russia over the course of the next few months. I think this is quite plausible. The Russian forces today, the Russian recruitment process drive, which began in January 2023, as far as I can see, has continued steadily at around 30,000 men a month. Sometimes it's dipped below that. There's been a few months where it's gone above it. But by now, significant numbers of troops have been mobilized, or rather have been drawn into the force in the Russian military in that way, and are available for combat. I suspect that one of the factors that has held the Russians back to some extent is that unlike the Ukrainians, the Russians do seem to be going through a lengthy process of training the men that they recruit, and by the way, the new brigades and divisions that they form to the requisite level before they commit them to battle. And then I'm going to make a quick observation. It is not enough simply to teach a soldier how he can be an infantryman or a tank driver or those sort of things. As Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis has pointed out many times, in order to have a proper, well-operating, efficient brigade, you need to train together as a brigade. You need to perfect and iron out all of the training issues. You need to have the staff trained and the officers and the command chain trained all to the right level. And the whole process, if you're starting from scratch, probably takes at least a year to do. At least a year to do. We are probably going to see the fruits of all of this probably this summer. So anyway, there we go. Already the Russians are advancing. This is before the major offensive in May begins. I am guessing it'll be late April, May. But despite that, the Russian lava flow continues to move westwards. Now, this may explain some of the recent moves. Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, a political figure who cannot be in any way described as anything else other than an inveterate opponent of President Putin's and someone who seems to be deeply hostile to Russia. Anyway, he has now disclosed that the Europeans have finally, grudgingly agreed with each other that this policy of not speaking to the Russians, of not talking to Putin, is simply impossible. With the Americans talking to the Russians, the Europeans have no choice but to do so as well. And apparently, a decision has been made by the so-called coalition of the willing, by the British, the French, and the others, that some representative of the Europeans will contact the Russians, will seek to speak to Putin himself at some point over the next couple of days, weeks, months. Nobody seems to know quite how soon. We're not told who this person is going to be, but it obviously isn't going to be Kaja Kallas. She was apparently extremely upset when at one of the Coalition of the Willing conferences, the Spanish Prime Minister, Mr. Sanchez, suggested that the Europeans do appoint a high representative to negotiate on their behalf. Kaja Kallas came back and said, well, that's me, obviously. I'm already assigned to that role. Sanchez apparently said in response, you must be joking, or words to that effect. There was a huge row between Sanchez and Kallas, but it's quite clear that Sanchez's view has prevailed. We haven't yet been told who this negotiator is going to be. Now, logically, once upon a time, 3 years ago, I would have said that the obvious person was Macron. He appeared to be more intelligent, more diplomatic than some of the other European leaders, though one has to say that the standard altogether is very low, and it would not be difficult for even Macron to surpass it. I cannot believe it will be Macron now, or at least if the Europeans do decide that it is Macron, then I guarantee that it will be a disastrous choice. It is difficult to overstate Russian contempt, dislike, and mistrust of Emmanuel Macron. I remember even back in February 2022, when I thought for a time that Macron was making a real effort to try to avert the war. He was going to Moscow, talking in all sorts of intelligent and brilliant ways, as sometimes French intellectuals do, about the wonderful things that could happen if the war could be avoided, and appeared to show some understanding of the Russian position and all of that. Anyway, I can remember at one of the Security Council meetings, the one that was made public, Russian officials talking then about how Macron would keep Putin up all night long, talking and coming up with all these brilliant comments and amazing ideas, but that the Russians always found it impossible to pin him down. Ever since then, they've seen the way that Macron behaves. Putin was found, for example, that he had a telephone conversation with Macron, or so he thought, except that Macron, without disclosing the fact to him, had representatives of the French media listening into their conversation at the same time. And Putin was furious about this. And of course, Macron has spoken incredibly aggressively and threateningly about the Russians. His finance minister back in February 2022 said that the Europeans, together with the Americans, were seeking to destroy the Russian economy, something the Russians have never forgotten. Macron has came up with all kinds of ideas about sending European troops to Ukraine, French troops at various times. He's been talking about that for over a year. He has been incredibly aggressive towards the Russians during this period. And as far as the Russians are concerned, he is seriously damaged goods. The trouble is, if it isn't going to be Macron, it's not obvious who else it would be. I think that the Russians have already assessed Starmer as essentially a man who is a mixture of a non-entity and a fanatic. Somebody, in other words, that it is impossible to hold any kind of substantive conversation with. The British Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, I think is also someone whom the Russians would struggle to work with, and I'm going to be too polite to set out my own views about David Lammy. I'm going to be polite and avoid doing that. The Russians will not be if he is the person who is sent to Moscow. So I don't for the moment know who it is exactly that the Europeans might send. It might be Sanchez. That might not be a bad choice. Sanchez is a clever man. He is unscrupulous, and some would say unprincipled. He is a master manipulator of Spanish politics. I am no fan of Sanchez. I want to make that quite clear. But nonetheless, he does impress me as somebody who has intelligence, combines intelligence of a certain type, and perhaps genuine diplomatic skills. As for the Italians, Meloni and Salvini and people like that, they would probably be the best choice of all from a Russian point of view. But I cannot imagine that the other Europeans would trust them. Anyway, the very fact that Stu is saying that the Europeans have come to this conclusion may be a sign that some level of reality, both about the military and the diplomatic situation, is starting to break through. Maybe. We'll see. Anyway, in the meantime, Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's envoy, has been in Washington. He's had his meetings with Witkoff, and he's been speaking. And he's been speaking quite a lot, actually. He's come out of these meetings looking very pleased. He says that he's had constructive meetings with the Americans. He's told the Americans that Russia is in no great hurry to have the sanctions on Russia lifted. Many Russians believe, this is a direct quote from Dmitriev, many Russians believe that sanctions actually have been good to transition Russia from dependence on the West. If you look at our GDP growth, it was still 4% last year versus 1% for Europe. And our debt to GDP ratio is 18% versus another 100% for Europe. So our economy has done well, and we don't ask for any sanctions relief. He's also said other things. He says that he's found the Americans actually fairly attentive prior to meetings. Some people, Biden people and Europeans, were advocating solutions they knew were not possible. So there was a focus to take a position that is not a real solution and to say, do this, knowing that it's not possible. With the Trump administration, we are now in the realm of thinking about what is possible, what can really work, and how we can find a long-term solution. And Dmitriev said that the Americans were attentive to the various things that he had to say, and that he was treated with great courtesy. And he made fairly clear, by the way, that he didn't just speak to Witkoff, he spoke to other American officials, though he was very careful not to identify who they were. I'm going to make a guess that one of them might have been J.D. Vance, or at least maybe aides of J.D. Vance. I say that because Dmitriev actually said some very polite things about J.D. Vance. That J.D. Vance did seem to have a good understanding of the matter. But it's likely that there were others as well. And I still think that there is an outside chance that one of the people he may have met privately was none other than Donald Trump himself, though, of course, I don't know that, and I don't want to pretend that I do. Anyway, the word in Europe is that we should expect now another Trump-Putin telephone call at some point over the next few days. Now, having said all of this, it's important to go back to what Dmitriev is saying. He says that with Trump administration, we are now in the realm of thinking about what is possible, what can really work, and how we can find a long-term solution. Now that tells us that the Russians are continuing to insist that the solution has to be to the entire conflict. It can't just be a temporary ceasefire. It must, as the Russians like to say, address the root causes of the war. But it also says that so far it's only thinking. We're in the realm of thinking about what is possible, what can really work. In other words, they haven't come to any kind of agreement, and no consensus has been reached. The Russians are floating ideas, perhaps like Putin's UN idea, which Trump said that he was angry with. I don't believe he was really angry about it, by the way. But anyway, we're still in the realm of ideas rather than actual proposals. And I noticed that Dmitriev avoided saying much about the Black Sea Initiative, but he did say, quite interestingly, that American businesses do seem to be keen to re-enter the Russian market, even interested in replacing European companies there, something which will not go down well in Europe at all, by the way. Anyway, we'll see. Now, the Americans endlessly, constantly suggest that we are close to some kind of deal. Trump has been up to that again, I think, over the last 24 hours. The Russians never say this. I had a discussion earlier today with Sofia Midkiff, Small Town Voice, commentator on Chinese affairs, somebody who knows an awful lot about China and what goes on there. She made the point to me that American officials constantly give the impression that a deal about the future of TikTok is just round the corner, but the Chinese authorities themselves never confirm this. And it's the same over Ukraine, that the Americans always give the impression that we are much closer to a deal than we really are. I wonder whether this is partly intended to keep the Europeans unsure and to keep them and the Ukrainians uncertain. But anyway, it does look as if some kind of Putin-Trump call may happen over the course of the next couple of days. And as always, it is the military developments, the developments on the ground, which are driving the situation. Well, there we are. This is where I'm going to finish my program today. There's a lot more news about things in the Middle East. There's a growing view that Israel is prepared to launch some kind of all-out assault on Gaza. But there are also reports that the Israeli military is finding it difficult to call up reservists. Reservists are unwilling to serve in Israeli units that would be launched in that kind of offensive, and that this is creating some kind of tensions in Israel. There's also a steady drumbeat about a possible war between the United States and Israel on the one hand, and Iran on the other. So lots is going on there. There's been developments in many other places. The civil war in the Sudan, which we covered extensively on the Duran when it started, but which we have appallingly neglected since then, has now taken a dramatic turn with the Sudanese army's recapture of the capital of Khartoum. There's an awful lot going on, but I'm going to have to deal with all of that in my next program. We are today in a different world from the one we were in 2-3 months ago. As I said, America has begun a retreat. It's not an abdication of its great power position. It speaks of renewed conflict with China, and it also appears to be writing off most of the Asian countries as potential allies of China. So it's a very ominous situation that is developing potentially in the Pacific. But I still get the sense that in Europe itself, despite honeyed words of reassurance just made to NATO by the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, that retreat is now fully underway. The Americans seem to be intent on retreating from Europe. Donald Trump makes little secret of his disdain for the Europeans. The Europeans have reacted very hostilely to his sanctions, to his tariffs rather. And I also get the sense that where Ukraine is concerned, the Americans are not clear yet what to do or where to go, but they understand that the war is lost and that the conviction that there used to be behind it has melted away. Anyway, but more from me soon. In my next few programs, let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. If you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.